Hi everyone, Dr. Laura here. Today I wanted to go over the 10 usability heuristics for user interface design from the Nielsen-Norman group. I'll be providing the link for this article in the comments, in the description as well. So Jacob Nielsen's 10 general principles for interactive design, they're called heuristics because they're broad rules of thumb, not specific usability guidelines. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these 10 heuristics today. Number one, the visibility of a system status. The design should always keep users informed about what is going on through appropriate feedback within a reasonable amount of time. All right, so when a user knows their current system status, they learn the outcome of their prior interactions and it helps them determine their next step. Predictable interactions create trust in the product as well as the brand. Think about a time when maybe you submitted a form or you were signing up for something and then you got no feedback. You didn't know if the action you just activated did anything. You didn't know if you needed to resubmit something or reload, or if reloading would void what you just did, right? So that visibility of system status is very important. So an example of this is you are here indicator on a mall map, shows people where they currently are and helps them understand where to go next. If you don't understand where you are in relation to everything else, it's really hard to make your next decision. A match between system and the real world. The design should speak the user's language, use words, phrases, and concepts familiar to the user rather than internal jargon. We want to follow real-world conversations, make information appear in a natural and logical order. The way you should design depends very much on the specific user. Terms, concepts, icons, and images that seem perfectly clear to you and your colleagues may be unfamiliar or confusing to your users. So when designing controls, follow real-world conventions and correspond to desired outcomes. This is called natural mapping. When you view the article, there's a link you can check out to get more information about natural mapping. It's easier for users to learn and remember how the interface works. This helps to build an experience that feels intuitive. So an example of this is when a stovetop controls match the layout of the heating element, users can quickly understand which controls map to which heating element, right? So we're matching the system and the real world. It's physically easy for me to grab that knob and associate its position, the knob's position, to the heating coil's position. An example of what can be tricky with this is if you're not matching that to the real world and the system, it's very easy to get confused between the physical control and the location that it is matching with, right? Number three, user control and freedom. Users often perform actions by mistake. They need to clearly mark emergency exit to leave an unwanted action without having to go through an extended process. When it's easy for people to back out of a process or undo an action, like a back button, it fosters a sense of freedom and confidence. Exits allow users to remain in control of the system and avoid getting stuck or feeling frustrated. A big example of this is if you're going through a process to fill out a form or a application process, right? And there's multiple steps. It can be really difficult if there isn't a way to go back to a previous step. As someone moves forward, they might get new information in a section that changes something that they've already submitted. If they can't go back, they might have to completely abandon and resubmit everything, which depending on the process could be incredibly frustrating and might create a dropout rate. By having that simple back button or allowing someone to jump back and forth, it alleviates that stress and allows, again, for that control. An example of this is digital spaces need quick emergency exits, just like physical spaces do, right? Also, having the control or freedom to maybe save something can create that safety net. Sometimes things come up in our physical world that interrupt or stop what we're doing in the digital world. Number 4, consistency and standards. Users should not have to wonder whether different words, situations, or actions mean the same thing. Following platform and industry conventions is important. So Jacob's law states that people spend most of their time using digital products other than yours. Users' experience with those other products sets their expectations. Failing to maintain consistency may increase the user's cognitive load by forcing them to learn something new. And as we know, with our cognitive load, we only have the ability to hold so much at one time, right? And the higher our cognitive load is, the more difficult it is to conduct other tasks simultaneously. So if we're failing to maintain that consistency, we might be creating a situation that confuses our users or makes them feel like they're unable to use a product or a service. An example of this heuristic is check-in counters are usually located at the front of a hotel. This consistency meets customer expectations. For instance, when you walk into a hotel and immediately you go to the counter, right? This is also similar to restaurants. Normally you walk into the front of a restaurant and there's a hostess stand where you're supposed to be seated. Sometimes, however, if you walk into a different door, you might have to find that hostess stand, and that could be confusing, or you might be uncertain if you're supposed to just seat yourself. So thinking about how that translates to a digital space, a common standard that is currently used is the 3 bars for a hamburger menu on a mobile device. This is now a standard. Most people understand that if they click on 3 stacked bars, they're going to get a menu that they can then navigate. And if suddenly you decide that instead of 3 stacked bars, you want to use the icon for a lion roaring, people have no understanding or connotation as to what that could mean. So they're not necessarily going to associate it with the menu bar. So keeping that consistency that has been established will help people understand what's going on. Number 5, error prevention. Good error messaging are important, but the best designs carefully prevent problems from occurring in the first place. Either eliminate error-prone conditions or check for them and present users with a confirmation option before they commit the action. So there are 2 types of errors, slips and mistakes. Slips are unconscious errors caused by inattention. Mistakes are conscious errors based on a mismatch between the user's mental model and the design. All right. So a slip, let's say you're having to click through multiple areas to get somewhere, and you've got maybe dialog boxes you're clicking through, and you just keep clicking through them, and all of a sudden you click and you realize, oh, I should have changed that last setting. I didn't actually want to click through, right? So that is an example of a slip. And then a mistake is where, again, the mental model is different, right? So a user thinks they're performing an action that's going to create one outcome, and instead it creates a different outcome because the designer and the user were thinking about that action differently. So an example of this is having guardrails on a curvy mountain road, which prevents drivers from falling off a cliff, hopefully. You want to make sure that you create those digital guardrails. If there is something where there's a high error rate, then figuring out either how to eliminate that, or again, providing that confirmation. Did you really mean you want to delete your entire paper, right? So having that double check before that action is completed. Recognition rather than recall. You want to minimize the user's memory load by making elements, actions, and options visible. The user should not have to remember information from one part of the interface to another. Information required to use the design, example, field labels or menu items, should be visible or easily retrievable when needed. Humans have limited short-term memory, and interfaces that promote recognition and reduce the amount of cognitive effort required from users. An example of this is it's easier for most people to recognize the capitals of countries instead of having to remember them. People are more likely to correctly answer the question, is Lisbon the capital of Portugal, rather than what is the capital of Portugal? Okay, so keeping, again, those visible user interfaces, the types of actions, keeping them similar, and then providing people with that information hint so that it can help with their recall instead of relying on, or help with that recognition instead of relying on recall. Flexibility and efficiency of use. Shortcuts hidden from a novice user may speed up the interactions of the expert user so that the design can cater to both inexperienced and experienced users. You want to allow users to tailor their frequent actions. So flexible processes can be carried out in different ways so that people can pick whichever method works for them. So having that flexibility and efficiency, really this talking about the novice and the experienced user. There may be some cases where a first time or novice user doesn't need all of the advanced steps because they're not ready to work through those processes. So having them all laid out is going to overload that cognitive load. It's going to create potentially anxiety and a desire to maybe, get out of that product or service because it's too much. Once someone has learned a system, having those efficiency shortcuts in place for an experienced user and allowing someone to tailor them to that specific user's needs really increases the usability of that specific product for that individual. So an example of this is regular routes are listed on maps, but locals with knowledge of the area can take shortcuts. Number 8 is aesthetic and minimalist design. Interfaces should not contain information that is irrelevant or rarely needed. Every extra unit of information in an interface competes with a relevant unit of information and diminishes their relative visibility. Okay, and so this is another reason why number 7 is so important, right? Because there might be something that for most users is not frequently used, but for a handful of users is used all the time. And so one can tailor it. That way we can limit the, minimize some of those interface interactions. This heuristic doesn't mean you have to use flat design. It's about making sure you're keeping the content and visual design focused on the essentials. You want to ensure that the visual elements of the interface support the user's primary goals. An example of this is an ornate teapot may have excessive decoration elements like an uncomfortable handle or a hard to wash nozzle that can interfere with usability. So while it may look aesthetically wonderful, the functionality is then diminished because of that aesthetic. So as we are applying different aesthetics to a product or service, we want to make sure that they are serving that functionality and creating a space where people can easily access the most important content or actions. We want to help, number 9, we want to help users recognize and diagnose and recover from errors. Errors happen, right? Error message should express in plain language, not error codes, precisely and indicate the problem and constructively suggest a solution. If you make it so people don't understand how they can move forward, they may have to Google an error code to find a forum with a solution. Those extra steps are going to drive people away. If you provide a solution in a constructive way, people can more easily recover from that error. So error messages should be present with visual treatments that will help users notice and recognize them. So providing that aesthetic. An example is a wrong way sign on the road reminds drivers that they're headed in the wrong direction and asks them to stop, right? So something that's pretty critical. Hey, pay attention. I don't think you meant to do this. By using digital error messages, we can provide the same way of suggesting and rerouting people back to the actions they actually wanted to take. And number 10, help and documentation. It's best if the system doesn't need any additional explanation. However, it may be necessary to provide documentation to help users understand how to complete their tasks, especially in a more complex product or service. Documentation is an incredibly helpful tool. Help and documentation content should be easy to search out and focus on the user's tasks. Keep it concise and list the concrete steps that are needed to be carried out. Think about the last time you needed to locate documentation or a help section. You've encountered a specific problem generally, and you're trying to navigate through that specific problem. It's a task-specific thing. Most of the time, people don't go into the help or documentation before they start going through a product or service. They only go to it after they've encountered an issue or they have a question specifically, generally speaking. Here's a tip. Information kiosks at airports are easily recognizable and solve customers' problems in context and immediately. So giving that help documentation a place that is easy for people to go back to, even if you've provided like an initial tutorial or walkthrough, maybe the first time someone uses a product or service, you need to be able to go back to that in the future if someone wants to. But it's not something you want to see every time you open up a product or service. Okay, so these are the 10 heuristics. And I would highly encourage you to check out this link that's provided in the description. There's a lot of great information listed here and linked out from this article. So spend a little time going through it and learning about the 10 usability heuristics for user interface design from the Nielsen Norman Group. Thank you very much for listening.